Thank you, Theo, and good morning, everyone. Really great to be here with you today in Berlin. Firstly, I appreciate you partying not too hard last night, so great to see so many of you here bright and early on a Friday morning. So I'm Avi. I'm a medical doctor by background and currently work for IBM, where I've been for the last 7 years. I'm an associate partner and IBM's clinical safety officer, working in their healthcare and life sciences consulting practice. And I'm joined here by a couple of my colleagues as well, who'll be doing a great presentation later as well. So the focus of my presentation today is all going to be about how do you design for safety in digital health? What does this even mean? And so we've got a bit of a packed agenda to get through in the next 40 minutes. I'm going to start off by just explaining a little bit about what is clinical safety in digital health and why does it matter. We'll then take you through a very high-level overview of IBM in healthcare and also a bit of the history of IBM design in healthcare. And then I'm going to invite my colleague, design director Flora, up onto the stage with me just for an interactive conversation about what is our cross-discipline approach to really designing for safety in digital health, and share some practical examples with you. And then we will finish off with just a few final tips for those out there. So a lot to cover, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time for Q&A, but I will be around all day, so really keen to connect with everyone on a personal level. I just want to start, though, by taking you back to 2012. So I was a junior doctor in a busy intensive care unit in a London hospital. And we just finished the morning ward round, and we were looking after very sick patients, as you can imagine, in the intensive care unit. And as a junior doctor, I was responsible for ordering a suite of investigations and tests for all the patients on the unit. This includes things like x-rays, blood tests, and so forth. And one particular patient we were looking after was a lady who had been admitted with a severe bacterial infection. And I'd ordered an x-ray for her to check the latest nasogastric tube placement. And this is a feeding tube that goes in through the nose, down through the esophagus, and into the stomach. It helps patients who are struggling to feed themselves. And so they get a liquid feed through the tube. Very common x-ray that's ordered to check the positioning of the tube. And so I ordered that x-ray, and my registrar was responsible for checking that once it was back. And as you can see, the registrar checked the x-ray a few hours later, and you can see here the nasogastric tube is going down into the midline and nestling nicely into the stomach. And so the registrar informed the nurse that the NG tube is in the correct position and the feed could commence. There was only one problem. So this was an x-ray from that patient, but it was an x-ray from 4 days ago when the last nasogastric tube had been placed. Now, NG tubes commonly come out and have to be replaced, and actually this was the x-ray from that morning. And as you can see here, sadly very different. In this case, the NG tube is entering the left main bronchus, going into the left lung. So when that nurse commenced feeding, all of that liquid feed was going straight into the patient's lung. And so the patient went into acute respiratory distress. You've got to remember this is a patient who is already severely unwell with a bacterial infection, intubated on the intensive care unit. And so they were transferred to an emergency respiratory specialist unit and had to undergo many more weeks of intense rehabilitation on top of the recovery they were already looking to make. Thankfully, the patient did survive, but it was a severe insult. So a lot of things went wrong that day. This could have been prevented and avoided. If you think about the health IT system that the doctor was using, it wasn't necessarily at fault, but it didn't help the doctor on that day, at that moment, to identify that actually the x-ray they were checking was 4 days old and there was a newer one that was still awaiting. And it didn't help the doctor, my registrar, to, in a way, do the right thing and avoid doing the wrong thing and checking the wrong x-ray. I, as a junior doctor who'd ordered the x-ray, we have this rule when you're a doctor, you follow up, you check what you order. Was I at fault for not checking it myself and just relying on my registrar? Human factors were involved. So this is what we call a never event. These are safety events that should never occur, but they still do, and they still happen today. And for me personally, this was my first major patient safety incident as a doctor. And to be honest, it's probably shaped my career since. It's probably why I still retain a very enthusiastic and strong commitment to patient safety in all the work I do as I've moved into the digital health space. And so I just want to emphasize this point, that really safety is the foundation of healthcare. As a doctor, it was the first and most important lesson I learned is how to act safely. But the sad thing is, unsafe care is still one of the leading causes of death worldwide. And incidents like that still happen today. And if you look at some of the stats around unsafe care and adverse events, they're pretty shocking. So what does this have to do with digital health and health technology? Well, as we all know, in recent years, we've seen a rapid advancement in the design, development, and adoption of digital health solutions technologies. And they have significant potential to improve care and actually improve patient safety. However, they can also introduce clinical risks leading to patient harm. Now, this is an example from something that hit the newspapers in 2016 in the UK. And this is a risk calculator that is used by general practitioners to basically calculate and predict the risk of a patient having a stroke or heart attack in the next 10 years. You enter some very basic information, your age, weight, smoking status, and it gives you a risk score. And the GP can then determine whether they should give you a therapy or not based on that score. Now, what had gone unnoticed was that this very simple risk calculator had been incorrectly integrated and mapped within the GP system. And it had gone unnoticed for several years. And when it was noticed and an investigation was conducted, it found that over 260,000 patients have been impacted by this simple, incorrect mapping error. And I mean, look at how basic this system is, this digital health solution. And that meant over 260,000 patients now received the incorrect therapy, so maybe they received a statin or some other medication that they shouldn't have, or even worse, those who really should have received a therapy didn't because they had the wrong risk score calculated. And again, this went unnoticed for several years before it was actually flagged in 2016. And it didn't happen just once, but multiple times. Imagine then when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're in this new era. I'm sure you're all sick of reading the headlines on generative AI and ChatGPT, but we are in a new era of new technologies. And so when we think about AI and autonomous systems, we have to be even more careful about the potential clinical risk these are introducing into patients. And so there's a lot we still don't understand about new technologies like generative AI, and so clinical risk and safety needs to be in the forefront. So ultimately, what is digital clinical safety about? It's essentially about this: ensuring that digital health IT systems are designed, developed, implemented, used, and decommissioned with safety at the core to reduce the potential risk of harm to patients. That is it. I want to make an important point though. It's not about safe versus unsafe. It's about managing risk responsibly. So as a clinical safety officer, I may be responsible for actually signing off a safety case report for a digital health or health IT solution. I cannot sign off and say this solution is safe in a way. But what I can say, because there will always be some inherent risks, what I can say is that we manage risk responsibly to reduce the risk of harm to patients to a level that is acceptable and tolerable. So we've done whatever we can to reduce that risk as much as possible to an acceptable level. And so just quickly, I'm often tasked with a really hard activity, and that is, how do you make some really boring work? I mean, come on, standards. I know there was a talk yesterday on regulation, and I'm part of that space myself, but let's be honest, it's pretty boring to try. How do you make it sexy and exciting so people actually pay attention and adopt it in their day-to-day work? And so we have a couple of clinical safety standards in the UK. These are mandatory by law. I encourage you to make a note of these because the documentation around them is freely available online. And actually, I encourage others from other countries where they don't have these standards implemented to actually look at this and look at best practice in the UK. And so there are two standards. They're part of what we call our digital technology assessment criteria. So that means in the UK, any new digital health solution that's being implemented in the NHS has to meet a baseline set of criteria of standards to be accepted. No hospital will even think about looking at your health app or digital health solution unless you've got the DTAC. And clinical safety is criteria number one. So you need to meet these standards, not optional. And the important point, because I know you had a talk yesterday about medical device regulation, this goes beyond medical devices. This includes all health IT systems, including medical devices and software as well. So I'm not going to go into this, but this is aligned with the medical device directive. So if you have a medical device, then these standards are covered within that, but it also includes all solutions that are not part of that. So what does this mean actually? So what do you do? How do you reduce risk and mitigate risk? And essentially what these standards are about, these three things, enforcing them. So firstly is risk analysis. What can go wrong? Secondly, risk evaluation. How serious can it be and how likely is it to occur? And then third, risk control. What should we do about it? Very important. What controls can we put in place from a design experience perspective to reduce that risk further? And this is not a one-time activity. This has to be done throughout the life cycle of the digital health IT solution. So all the way from scope, initial designs, development, implementation, use, decommissioning. And again, just so you're aware, the two standards, one is focused on the developer of the health IT solution, and the other standard is focused on the implementer. They effectively say the same thing, but they're just saying both parties need to be involved. So the 129 is the developer. That's typically what IBM is responsible for usually. We're developing, designing a health IT solution. We need to conform to that. 160 is, let's say, the hospital implementing that health IT system. They need to conform to that. But the two standards effectively say the same thing. Very quickly, at a high level, again, you don't need to know this in detail, but if you download those standards today, you'll probably close it immediately because it's over 100 pages. If I were to summarize those 100 pages into 5 bullet points, this is what they're asking us to do. The first thing is nominate a clinical safety officer. I can ask, how many of you have heard of that said before, clinical safety officer? 1, 2, 3. Okay, a few. So again, this is I would say, a role that's come into force maybe in the last decade. You probably have an equivalent term, maybe in Germany, but really important role around a clinician who is trained in clinical risk management. And so I'm the clinical safety officer for IBM. Important to have one nominated by the solutions and scope. Second is how you establish a clinical risk management system. That is at an organizational level. So for me, that's at IBM saying, how do we as IBM do clinical risk across the company? What are the policies, procedures, processes we put in place to do that? Point 2. Point 3, for that specific solution, so let's say you're now building a health app for whatever patient with diabetes or to support a patient management. For that health application, you need a clinical risk management plan in place. Specifically, how are we going to manage clinical risk for this health app? Point 4, then you actually need to do the activities, and I'll talk about it in a bit more detail and fill out some paperwork, which the clinical safety officer signs off. And then 5, you need to do this throughout the life cycle of the solution. That's why it's really important that it's baked in as part of the design and development process, and not just like a tick box activity to do at the end. So I've been really fortunate at IBM to actually work with teams from different industries. Look, healthcare is not inventing this standard. We're learning from other safety critical industries like aviation, defense, oil and gas, nuclear, and so forth. And so I'm actually, in setting up IBM's clinical risk management, took huge inspiration from the work we do in the Ministry of Defence in the UK. And we actually, IBM, we have a contract for what's called the Guardian aerial threat detection system. It basically supports our RAF of identifying potential threats in the sky. So IBM delivers that contract for the Ministry of Defence. And if I were to show you their safety management system, I mean, the standards they have to comply with in defence are on another level. But what we can do is take the best practice and implement it in a more localized way in healthcare. So that's what I've done in our healthcare practice. And again, boring, super boring, policies, procedures, SOPs, templates, but really important. So it's all there in case people need it and in case we need more guidance. So then that brings me now into probably the more interesting part. How do you design for safety? And I had the real pleasure of working with Flora, Sarah, and their team around this interdisciplinary approach of bringing clinical safety with our designers and really thinking about our approach to user-centered design and how we can lead with safety that in every engagement and really make it a differentiator for IBM and the work we do as well. And obviously avoid horrific design issues like that. So quickly, what do we do at a practical level? And I just want you to be aware of these things in case you're ever brought into a workshop, if you've never been part of one so far. Can I ask, how many people have been involved in a clinical risk management workshop? 2, 3, 4. Okay, be interested in your thoughts later. So what we're trying to essentially do is, for that health IT system, we're trying to identify potential hazards. What I mean by a hazard is, let's say we're talking about a health application to support a patient with maybe getting a prescription. What would happen if something went wrong? What's the hazard there? What if the wrong patient is identified in the prescription? What if that message never gets through the prescription actually never gets ordered? So those are potential hazards. Estimate risk, evaluate if the risk is acceptable, implement the risk controls, and then reevaluate that risk. And what we like to do is, you don't want to boil the ocean here, because you can spend a lot of time talking about this. Focus on the risks, focus on the hazards which have the greatest risk. Those things where if something goes wrong, you'll see there's potentially a severe impact to patients. So again, you can boil the ocean with these types of discussions. That's not the aim. Focus on the hazards with the greatest clinical risk. And so what I am doing as a clinical safety officer is facilitating what we call a hazard workshop. All it is a multidisciplinary meeting involving designers, developers, technical architects, clinical folk like myself, users, and we try to break the solution. We break it, we evaluate, we try to identify hazards, brainstorm as many as we can, and then evaluate risk of those hazards, document them, and then try to identify them. Okay, we've identified a hazard, we've evaluated the risk is acceptable. How can we make a design change to reduce the risk? How can we make a process change? How can we make can we put in place better training? And all these other things to think about, again, reducing that risk. So again, if you're ever part of a hazard workshop, I encourage you to speak up. It's often the simplest observations that can make the biggest impact, and some things that often come from non-clinical folk, and that's why it's really important that designers, developers, and everyone are involved. And just so you're aware, we'll use things like matrices like this to assess risk, and so we'll see, the stuff in red is obviously really bad, and we need to break it down to the sort of yellow-green area. And these are standardized across industries. So again, we're not reinventing this in healthcare. It's very simple. It's a little bit subjective, so it all depends on who's facilitating, but it's all about having really useful discussions, multidisciplinary discussions around reducing risk. And again, just to re-emphasize the point, it's always going to be hard to eliminate risk. So what we try to do is get to this middle point, what you may get to as low as reasonably practicable, or as far as possible, or as far as low as tolerable. And this is this concept of sort of tolerable risk. To say any further efforts in risk reduction will probably outweigh any potential benefit. So again, it's that trade-off. It's how much more can we do versus actually the benefits going to be achieved. So really just trying to get to that area of tolerable and acceptable risk. And what we're really trying to do is this. So I've been with IBM for 7 years. And in my first stint, I was part of Boston Health, and we were building really sophisticated AI-powered clinical solutions in healthcare. I mean, decision support solutions that clinicians can use to make treatment decisions for patients. And in full transparency, it was being a clinician in the business early on. It was tough because you're pushed to, release it. We need to release new functionality fast, quickly. What is this clinical safety thing? This is slowing us down. let's just release it, it's fine. What's going to happen? And so what we're trying to do is change the culture. We absolutely have. It's all for education enablement to go away from these types of statements that I offer here. Sure, it'll be fine, it's clinical safety, just going to delay your release. It doesn't really fit with our process to this. Where's our clinical risk management plan? Have we updated the housing law? We need to review the risk of the latest functionality before release, and it really is so important. So that's just a bit of an intro to clinical safety within a digital health context. Again, I've given a very high level overview, just so you're aware of some of the concepts and the importance of it. What I want to do now is just move into the next part of the discussion, which I just want to briefly introduce IBM in healthcare. Because some of you probably won't even know what does IBM even do in healthcare and how we relevant. So very simply, IBM is a global technology and consulting organization. We have expertise in AI, hybrid cloud, analytics, and those are our core areas of focus. We've been around for over 112 years, a long time, and actually, I think it was Time magazine that highlighted IBM as still one of the most relevant companies today. I think that's pretty impressive, to be around for 112 years and still be one of the most relevant companies today. So, I'm just going to play a short video just to share a little bit about what we do in healthcare in the UK. So just a snippet of some of the work we're doing in the UK over the last few years. Of course, we do a lot of work in Germany as well in the digital health space. Some of you may know IBM's work with the TK app and a project we've been part of for the last 5 years in helping deliver that personal electronic patient record across Germany for citizens. But really what we're trying to do is bring together our innovative technology to help build small. So that means bringing together that technology and advanced analytics, our deep industry expertise, our big focus on human-centered design, and our expertise and leadership in trust and security. And again, just a few other examples of some of the work we're doing. This is mainly in the UK focus, but we obviously have a global healthcare practice, national strategic projects, and we'll be hearing a little bit about how we design for national citizen-facing health applications and some of the work we're doing with NHS England in that space. At a local level, digital transformation partners for many hospitals and hospital trusts. Also working with agencies like Genomics England around helping to implement genomic testing across the UK. So some really interesting work at a national and local level. I now want to just invite my colleague Flora onto the stage, if she's, and just to share a little bit about the history of IBM design in healthcare.
Thank you, Avi. Hello, I'm Flora. I'm design director at IBM. I work in our healthcare practice. And Avi's talked a lot about what IBM does now. I think I wanted to give you a little overview of why do we do that now. Because we've actually been doing it for a while. So I've talked about the fact that IBM is a really, really old company, been around for a very long time. Didn't have that name at the beginning. We're called something else at the start. But segue into this thing, which if you're a designer, you probably have seen before. And if you're not, maybe you're just an enthusiast of chairs. It's the Eames Lounger. It's a very, very iconic piece of industrial design, and designed by some very famous people. But some of you may not know, or some of you may know, that people who designed that chair, globally recognised, massive piece of design, also designed this thing, which is a leg splint, which was used in World War II. I think it was designed for the American Army because they had ones that were metal, that were expensive, heavy, difficult to transport, were taking materials away from other things that people needed to build, and were really, really bad for the patients because your legs are not straight like a bit of metal. So Charles and Ray Eames, who designed that chair, the reason they could design that chair was they pioneered the technology to affect the plywood, the materials they were using. They pioneered that, making this, which was actually formed around Charles Eames's own leg in his design lab with their team. They came up with a new way of doing this, and it was much cheaper, it was much better for the patients, they didn't get secondary injuries as a result of the splinting. It was much cheaper, it was much better, all around great design. Why am I talking about them? Because they were two of the four kind of founding members of IBM's original design program in 1956. And I like to think about it as kind of all of those values that they put into those medical products they were designing before they started working at IBM have kind of formed the culture that Sarah and I are part of, and that Avi's kind of been around in our design teams. So health, kind of design for health that we're doing at the moment is still relatively new because digital health has not been around for that long. That kind of the ethos and the culture of why we do what we do and why we care so much about working in healthcare and doing the right things is something that's been part of our kind of design program from the very beginning. So that's why we care.
Brilliant, thank you. These mics look like they're
I think sure about it's how close they are.
Yeah, it is. Okay, fine. So next, I just want to spend 10 minutes. I'm going to grill Flora a little bit. Feel free to help on her experience as a design director in IBM and some of the work we're doing, particularly in the clinical safety space. So Flora, my first question for you is, can you tell me about your personal experience with clinical safety as a designer? And really, why does it matter?
Good question. So I think, well, I talked about the kind of the wider culture. I actually started my career not working in health, but working in kind of wider government programs, a lot to do with social security. And I think in those environments, there isn't a clinical safety officer, there isn't a person who's responsible for kind of, does the thing you're building have potential harm? And is anybody monitoring that we're trying to reduce that potential harm? So one of the very kind of first projects I did that was really big at a national scale, I was looking at how the UK government, people that work for the UK government can see information about people in the country and decide whether or not they are eligible for social security and help paying for things, if they're low income or if they have disabilities or whatever it might be. And they had an old system that we were trying to replace that basically resulted in loads of errors, either people being given money that they then had to pay back, which is awful, or even worse case, not getting the help that they needed at the time that they needed it because it was so complicated to make the decision because the data was really hard to understand. So I think at that point I realized there is something going wrong here, and I became really obsessed with understanding what is the potential impact of this thing and trying to design to make sure that that didn't happen, the bad thing didn't happen, and kind of working really closely with a lot of the users to say what's the worst thing that you've seen happen and how do we make that not happen. Which is then, as I kind of moved into healthcare and got really excited about that space, it's kind of followed me. So I guess it's something I've always been worried about, but I'm really liking that there are people like you in this space to make sure that make sure that somebody's really paying attention to it, that we have the rigor around those different standards and those different, how we document it to make sure we're doing it properly. But it makes me feel safe and secure.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, so one of the challenges I have when you have a title like clinical safety officer is everyone's like, well, it's my responsibility, right? Oh, clinical safety, Avi will sort that out. Obviously, that's not the case. So, from your perspective, though, how much influence can a designer or a UX researcher have? And what are your thoughts on that?
All of the influence.
Yeah.
I think we can make it go terribly wrong, and we can also make it go really, really right. So if I start with research, obviously you build your research plan. If you don't speak to the right people, you don't get the right insights, you don't know about the problems and the potential risks, and you can't catalogue them. and it's not your job to know everything about every user. That's kind of down to the research team. Obviously, from a UX and a content design perspective, what you create, what you build is going to have a really big impact. But also, if you're working more in a service design space, how you want to connect those systems and those backstage kind of systems and services can have a really big impact on the way that the information makes it to the front end that the UX designers and the content designers can work with. So I think there's a lot of influence both through the technology and through how it's how it's communicated to people that designers can own and influence and make good, even if the rest of your team isn't particularly interested in making it safe. As designers, you can sneakily do a lot in our roles, which is really nice.
Thank you. And then, so I know you're going to be speaking about this later, and I'm not going to steal that thunder. But we're obviously working on some really big projects in the UK, so national strategic. Can you maybe share with the audience that just maybe one or two challenges you found as a designer thinking about sort of critical safety and with some of the projects you've worked on?
Sure. Time frame. People wanting to do things faster. It doesn't give us the time to properly think about the consequences of things. I think it's definitely one. There's also, I've come across a few product managers in my time who have, on the surface been very pro clinical safety, but when it comes to there's a 0.1% chance this really, really, really bad thing might happen, but we're really worried about it because we think if we don't do this thing properly, that possibility could jump a lot. And sometimes people go, oh no, it's fine, don't worry about it. That's for the doctors to worry about. That's for the hospital who are implementing this to worry about. It's not for us to worry about with the product. And I always get a bit nervous because we don't control the rollout. We don't control the training that gets given to the staff. We don't control what the managers do to reinforce good behavior or any kind of behavior with the product. And that always makes me very nervous. So I think people who assume that the rest of the system will fix it for you and that we don't have to fix it ourselves is probably my biggest challenge and one I will keep raging against.
Brilliant, thank you. So I want to open it up to questions from the audience, then we'll finish up in the final 5 minutes with some tips, but I'm happy to take questions from anyone from either floor or myself.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure how to formulate the question in a good way.
Do you want to introduce yourself and your background as well?
Yes, so I'm Lina. I work for a period tracking app who has a CE mark and challenges the agile and quality management system change. And I guess my question is around documentation, because often documentation happens afterwards, or it's not perfectly, and actually there is a chance in supporting the process and doing it around the process. I was wondering if you have any tips and how to do it.
Yes, really. Sorry, it's actually one of my tips, but I'll address it now. It's a really good point. So there is a lot of documentation involved in, for example, even just clinical safety, let alone regular safety. What I've tried to do, and I think others do this as well, is we take a sort of templated approach. So we've kind of created sort of exemplar templates. For example, with clinical safety, you've got to produce 3 documents: clinical risk management plan, a clinical safety case report, and a hazard plan. And so, firstly, it's actually not that. Once you've done it once, it's actually easy then to replicate. So making that exemplar template is important to have that as a baseline. But then beginning the documentation at the beginning, and that's one of the challenges, because often it comes towards the end, you're looking towards a release or sign-off, and then people are like, where's our safety case report? And you're having to rush and almost retrofit everything to meet the criteria for release. And so what I try to do is firstly have templates, so that we're not starting from scratch, and it's easier to get going with the key areas aligned. It's not one person's responsibility. Everyone thinks it's my responsibility to write the documents. Absolutely not. It has to be a project approach. And so what I've tried to do is, on the project I've been involved in, delegate sections to the relevant counterparts early on as well, even if you're at the early design stage. Start building the clinical safety case report, start articulating the design for us within the documentation, and then of course someone like myself will have to review it and sign it off. So, but one important point is, don't let documentation paralyze you as well, because I've seen the opposite where people are writing pages and pages and pages, getting all into models around the hazard log and what column should be what and what everything means, and actually that's not helpful either. It's just stopping you from actually the real implementation of what you're trying to do. So those are some of the things I try to use if that's helpful. And maybe Laura, from your perspective.
Yeah, mine's probably a bit of a lower, like closer to the detail in their stories. But if anyone works in Agile and has user stories in Jira or Azure DevOps or whatever tool, we, or at least Sarah and I, have developed an approach where we use, we kind of follow what we used to do, what we do with accessibility. So kind of as part of your definition of ready, when all your design work is done, every single story has a sign-off as like, is there any kind of clinical safety consideration that's had to be taken for this story and these designs, this bit of functionality? And if so, was it signed off with some clinical safety officer or some kind of expert? And if so, what's the kind of the documentation that we have for that? So it doesn't have to be a thing you do at the end, it's something you do each sprint and just, is a little tiny extra bit of work on top of what you'd normally do, rather than it being terrifyingly huge towards the end of the project.
Yeah. That's helpful.
Yeah, thank you for the nice presentation. I have a question for actually from the design perspective for medical software applications. So to what extent do you recognize pressure from consumable products, setting expectations for medical software applications, and then still meeting the clinical safety regulations?
When you say pressure, do you mean in terms of time, in terms of functionality?
No, more in terms of the ways of interacting with the application.
Ah, right. Great question. So if you want to interact with another bit of software and it does a thing that is in your mind unsafe, and you're saying we can't interact with you if we can't interface with you if you continue to do that, that's not safe for us or it's not clear. There are multiple approaches. Sometimes I've seen people just say it's not going to work, we can't do it. Obviously that's the least good out of these options. In our work with the NHS, this happens quite often because companies will come along and be really proud of the thing that they've made and not maybe realize that they've introduced some risks. So often our preferred approach is that we'll try and work with them, trying to help them understand the risk, because sometimes people don't even realize, or maybe it isn't a risk for their standalone product, but when you put it into the wider ecosystem, it becomes a risk. So I think there's a lot of kind of helping people understand, and Avi often helps us with this and kind of how to explain it. And ideally, what happens then is they realize they want to invest in improving patient safety and they will kind of address it themselves. That doesn't always happen, however, because sometimes they don't want to spend more money or take the time or change their product because they believe that their product is correct. So I think then it becomes about what's within our control to fix, and are there things that we should put into place. One of the most powerful, I think, is kind of using metadata. So if a piece of information is coming in and maybe it's not as reliable as we want it to be to improve that clinical safety, adding additional information about its recency. Maybe the rest of the page updates every hour, but that updates only once a day, and it will say, actually, this was only updated yesterday. So we know that bit of information could be a bit out of date. So I think there's additional information you can use. It's not the cleanest option. Obviously, the best thing is that they update theirs and uplift it. But there's things we can do to help people understand that thing is not as reliable or not as safe as the other things, and allow the human, the hopefully highly trained, very capable human who's using it, to make more informed decisions. But what we can't do is hide the fact that it's not as good, because then that introduces the risk.
Can I add a perspective based on what I thought as well? So we often get, I often talk when you're at conferences, and I was like, we've got amazing digital experiences in banking and in travel, and look, I can do this on my British Airways app. Why is healthcare not like that? We're not catching up, and it's an unfair comparison, because you going and sort of downloading, booking a train ticket or an air ticket or downloading a boarding pass. I think it's slightly different to maybe downloading your health record or booking an appointment for a cancer screening. And so I think there is a pressure sometimes to meet that expectation now set because of the transformation that's happened in other industries and that consumerization where everyone is having these highly accessible and amazing digital experiences in every other industry, and we're constantly criticizing how healthcare is not keeping up. But we've got to recognize, we're highly regulated for a reason. Patient safety, patients' lives are at risk. And so yes, let's aspire to create those digital experiences and take the best if we can from other apps. If we do work with our other counterparts, and we've learned from other apps we've been building in finance and banking and travel and transportation, where we can take the best aspects of those and implement them into our health app. But I think it is an unfair comparison to expect us to keep pace with some other industries at times. Take one down.
Hi, my name is Ivana. I'm from MSD Pharmaceutical Company. I like your dramatic opening with a very bad story. And then you mentioned the secure safety assessment.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how does it work? Is it like assessment per diagnosis or per examination? Like what is assessed in that safety assessment?
You mean the clinical safety assessment I was talking about? So I'm more talking about the safety assessment of a digital health product. So let's say a health application, we did one period tracking app. So what's the potential risk of things going wrong in that app? So what would happen if that app gave the wrong period tracking advice? And all of the things. So it's that assessment, and we just look at the entire user journey and try and break it and see what's the risk at every point of the patient throughout all the functionality that app delivers. And so you've got simpler solutions and then more complex solutions where things get really tricky, where the clinical decision support solutions where assistants helping a doctor make a decision, that's where the risk just goes to another level. I'm just going to come here and that.
Thank you very much. I was curious to the relationship between the assessing the safety and getting the ISO. Is there a relation? Does it speed it up? Do they find new things to measure?
Do you mean the ISO standards?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as I think I mentioned in one of the slides, so the clinical safety standards in the NHS are aligned with the relevant ISO standards. So depending on where that digital health solution is classified, so if it's a medical device, if it's not, there is a associated ISO standard. So yes, it can, if you've got, let's say, the clinical safety standards in place and you've shown compliance and then your solution goes off and crosses the boundary to a medical device, you've done a lot of the work already, actually, and that will help you get the relevant standard. Any question here? No? Okay.
I have a simple question, because you mentioned about a hazard workshop. Can you tell a little bit more about how it looked like, what kind of exercises or elements you implement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thank you. So typically, usually around 2 hours in length. Again, representation from each different parts. So always designer, developer, technical, clinical, ideally a user in place as well, project management. So maybe there's between 6 and 10 people. Ideally in person, obviously hard these days. And what we'll start with, I will often give a brief overview of critical safety for 10 minutes, because most people have never been in a workshop before, have no idea. So just kind of an explanation of why we're doing this, and what are we trying to assess, and the standards. Then we'll often ask, usually the designer or developer, just to do a walkthrough of the system, end to end. So whatever that is, take us through the solution, and then we break it. We have a debate and a discussion, and what we start with is we don't get into templates and documents, we just have an open discussion to begin with, and start identifying hazards. What if, and there are a few different techniques that can be used. I use what's called a what if, SWIFT assessment, so structured what if technique, which is just, what if this happened, what if that happened? So I'm sort of prompting people to think of the extremities, and then the first thing is list as many hazards as possible, 5, 10. And then once we've kind of exhausted the hazards, we try to focus on the ones with greatest clinical risk, where, and really there's a high chance of something going wrong. Let's say the wrong patient is identified. It's pretty bad if that's the case. So, and then we'll try and assess the risk. I showed you those matrices. We'll just, for that hazard, we'll say, okay, what's the potential risk of this happening? How severe could it occur? What controls are in place today? So what do we have in place in the solution today that's limiting this? And then, most importantly, what are the additional controls? And usually one workshop is never enough. So we'll have some multiple workshops. And then once you've done the baseline assessment for digital health products, the subsequent ones are much easier because you just iterate on top of it. So all the documentation as well, actually, you're just doing the demos. The hard work is often at the beginning. The first time you do the assessment of the product is often the lengthiest and most complex. And then after that, you focus on major releases, so major functionality changes, and again, do the same thing. Break the product, assess the risk, quantify it, rate it, put in controls, and just make sure the controls, the worst thing is though, to finish, is if you've got it all in Excel, and then the Excel goes in a drawer somewhere, and no one sees it, it's pointless. We need to make sure it's actually linked to the development work, Jira tickets, and so forth. If that helps. Then I think we've got a question.
Thanks for the talk, and thanks for picking up such an important topic. My question is, so this talk was mainly about safety, and on this conference we're talking about user centricity. What if these two don't go in line? Can I give you an example? So I'm recently talking to a lot of surgeons, and actually surgeons do not value safety as high as, for example, other pillars like efficiency or efficacy, so better outcomes, better results, and saving time in their procedures. So what should we focus on? Is it safety or rather user centricity?
It's an interesting question. My wife's a surgeon, and I'd be interested to see if she agreed with the fact that she would choose efficiency over safety. So I think I need to speak to the surgeons you're interviewing. Because look, safety is the foundation, firstly, right? But there is a balance to be had. And I think it's critical from this perspective that you can't, again, boil the ocean of it, and it's, again, reducing those risks as far as possible to that tolerable, acceptable level, but balancing it with other areas. So, and I think that's where these multidisciplinary workshops are really important, because that's when you can have that discussion and try and trade off. But what I would always say is safety is number one, always in healthcare. And if anyone tells you otherwise, tell them to come and speak to me first. But also, tell them to reflect on how you cannot say safety is the first and most important thing. But I also agree that you don't want to kill innovation because we're just obsessed in the minutiae and this could and that could. We have to still innovate, we have to still implement. Nothing would get released otherwise. So I think it's a balance, safety first from my perspective.
Yeah, I haven't been in the exact same situation, but I think I know what you're talking about, where there are things that that the system must do, but also the doctors are saying, but now it's going to take too long, I don't want to do it, I just want to get in and out, go. And I think Sarah and I have tackled this a couple of times. It seems to happen particularly for clinical interfaces, because they're so used to doing them, and they know that the edge case that we're talking about is maybe happens for 2 out of 500 patients, that they have to do this special thing, but we're saying, but if you don't do that, serious harm comes to the patient, it needs to be in the core journey. And I think there is where we get to be more creative in our design. It's a lot harder, it makes our lives more difficult, and I think it's probably not the answer you're going to want to hear, but it's finding the compromise where we are comfortable, I will say, not necessarily happy as designers, but we're comfortable that we have done everything within our power to keep those patients safe. But ultimately, we're not the doctors. It's their care that's going to be administered to these people. And if they are happy that that risk is appropriate, and we believe that it's been mitigated as much as reasonably possible,
Yep.
which is the whole point, then I think that's kind of okay. But what I will say is if you're in a position where you can launch it and you don't have to then go away and work on something else, if you can keep an eye on it, those are things that we then put at our very, very top of our watch list. We run analytics on them, we do lots of user testing, we keep an eye on it. Because if we do need to change something once it's gone live, those are the kinds of things that we want to be really careful about changing or having another option to switch to really quickly if something is going wrong. Also, just write it down that you had a different opinion so that everybody knows it's documented, and if anything does go wrong, you're like, it's okay, we have a fix, it's right here, this will never happen again. Yeah.
I think final question.
Yeah.
You are also the company behind Watson.
Yes.
So I wonder, the workshop sounds very great and good. What extent have you used automation, machine learning to speed up the process of risk assessment?
That's a really great question, and that's absolutely something we're looking to do, something I've been talking to other clinical safety officers about in other companies. Because you're right, there's a lot of stuff we can do right now, very manual, even documenting hazards and everything else, and like you said, identifying risks that can be automated. So it's on my agenda, no doubt. I would love to do more and leverage on technologies to actually help us with our own processes. As you know, these things are never as easy as we find it easier to deploy AI in other fields than actually supporting our own internal processes. But it's a great question because it's on my agenda. I hope to do more. I know the clinical safety and risk management experts are doing this, and I know other products in other industries are already making this in using AI and automation. They're making it into the product that it automatically identifies risks and flags risks within the product using these technologies. So, evolving space, I think watch out, and thank you for the question. So I'm just going to finish, thank you for that, with just quick, don't go anywhere, Flora. Just final, rapid fire, final tips to leave on. So first tip number one, know those standards, rules, and regulations. I know it may sound boring, but just be aware of them, and if not, just know who your counterpart is. Identify clinical safety officer and safety engineer as well. They may not be clinical, and involve them early. There's no point bringing them on a week before you're trying to release something and say, hey, can you look at this? That's another frustration we always have is, oh, we're about to release, it's not been signed off. Hey, clinicians, sign it off. Get them involved at the beginning, reach out to them, you'd be surprised, they really want to help. Enable the whole team on principles of clinical safety. So this was last week, right? 2 weeks ago, I was doing a clinical safety enablement session for Flora's team on one of our critical projects. Again, an hour together talking about clinical safety education. So really, really important. Understand your data. I think Flora commented on this and what your users need from the data to make it really, really important. And I think part of user-centered design. Use consistency in patterns to reduce risks, even with things like hazards. A lot of the things, actually, if you look across solutions, the same type of hazard, same risk, even if the solution is drastically different, it's a very similar thing. So you can use consistency to simplify the process a lot. Hazard workshops, we've talked about a lot. Really important point to be open and honest. Sometimes I find some team members, they may have a point to make, but they'll think, oh, I'm not a health director. I'm not going to raise it. It sounds silly. Everyone's thought of it. The reality is probably no one's thought of it. It's an amazing point, and you absolutely should raise it. So I encourage you, if you're ever part of a hazard workshop, be open, honest, and I know clinicians can be hard to deal with sometimes, but it's really important that you are. We've talked about mitigating, focusing on hazards with greatest clinical risk. We talked about documentation a lot, not letting it paralyze you, but just doing and automating some of it as well. I'm stealing this from another clinical safety officer. This is the clinical safety cake. Literally baking clinical safety into product design and development. Not an afterthought, baked into design and development processes. So it's not an extra activity. And what we're trying to do, and I think it's that area as well, is make it a source of your competitive advantage. There are so many products out there, and I look at them, amazing health tech startups in terms of their marketing, but they're not really thought about safety at the level of they should have, I believe. I mean, there's a gap there. And we're seeing it with products and companies that are suddenly losing speed and going off radars. If you focus on safety and lead with safety and make it a source of your differentiation and competitive advantage, you're likely going to be around for the long term. And so I really think if you lean into this, it can be hugely beneficial to your work, whether you're a startup, corporate, or whatever. And I love the tagline for the conference. It is brilliant because that user experience really can save lives. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be around all day.